Hello, and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Tonight our guest is author, speaker, writer, and scholar, Joe Wolverton, JD. But first it's time for announcements and updates. The Stewart-Henry County chapter of the TFA's monthly meeting scheduled for October the 5th has been canceled and will be rescheduled. For good conservative talk radio, tune in to 105.3 WDXC Radio in Lawrenceburg from 5 to 6 p.m. on Mondays for the Kip Capley Show, and Wednesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. for the local GOP radio show hosted by Chair of the Lawrence County GOP, Brandon Taylor, and Lawrence Sutton, the Secretary of the Lawrence County GOP. If you have an announcement from a conservative organization you want announced on this show, send the information to tennesseeinformer.tv@gmail.com the Friday before the show. If you want our state to step up and push back on our overreach and often unconstitutional federal government, visit tncss@weebly.com and learn more about the nullification legislation we hope to get passed this session. There's no cost, it's an informational site, but we would like for you to click on the Substack tab to sign up. We need as many as we can get to show support for this effort. We need to put some teeth in the 10th in Tennessee. Our guest tonight is Joe Wolverton. He's a very knowledgeable scholar on the 10th Amendment and the Constitution in general, and has written several books and hundreds of articles on those topics. Joe holds a BA in political science from Brigham Young University and a JD from the University of Memphis. Mr. Wolverton is a featured speaker on Nullify Now and a featured contributor to the New American, where he writes on the Constitution, states' rights, and their surveillance state. He is the author of the books The Real James Madison, In What Degree of Madness? Madison's Method to Make America States Again. His latest book, The Founder's Recipe, provides selections from the 37 authors most often quoted by the founding generation. He hosts the YouTube channel Teacher of Liberty and the Instagram account of the same name. He writes on The Imaginative Conservative as well. Joe, thank you for joining us tonight. How's everything going?
Everything is going good. I'm real grateful to be on with you, especially here in my home state, which is always going to be the focus of my efforts to make Tennessee a republic again. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I'm grateful for you to have me on. Honestly, it's a great, I consider it honestly, without exaggeration, a sacred obligation to help out anybody who's working in this cause.
Well, we appreciate you being on, and we also appreciate you agreeing to sign on as one of our references, our constitutional scholar references for the TNCSS website. I really want to get right into this and get as much information out to the public as we can. You know, our federal government not only refuses to secure our borders, but is in fact orchestrating an invasion of unvetted illegal aliens into our country, thereby violating our sovereignty and putting our citizens at risk, while at the same time draining our resources. My first question is, does the Constitution delegate the power to the federal government to be the ultimate authority on issues of border security and immigration?
Well, you know, it's ironic that the conservatives, that we're so upset at the federal government for failing to implement any sort of common sense immigration policy, when in reality, the Constitution does not grant that authority to the federal government. So using the lens of the 10th Amendment, we can see that the power to control immigration into the several states is retained by the states. That which is not delegated to the federal government is retained by the states and the people. And if you look in the Constitution, the word immigration does not appear. The word naturalization appears, which is the process by which one becomes a citizen. But the way I always compare it to people is engagement is to marriage what immigration is to naturalization, right? You can be engaged 1,000 times a day. Goodness, you technically could. But once you get married, it's a legal thing. It's a different thing altogether. So the power in understanding the Constitution is immense and immeasurable, because we don't have to put up with the fact that the federal government is tyrannically and let's be honest, sadistically refusing to implement any sort of common sense policy regarding the influx of people across all our borders. And so we don't have to worry about them not acting, because in fact, we as a constitutionalist, you would prefer them not to act because they do not possess that authority in the Constitution. So states like Tennessee, and I mean, obviously some states have more to lose.
Right.
Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, et cetera. But even a state like Tennessee, we have a lot to lose because if Texas refuses to act and Arkansas refuses to act, that comes right up to our borders. And so the the great thing about it's one of these paradoxes, you see. The thing is, the federal government has not enacted any sort of common sense, workable immigration policy. And in reality, that's good because they don't have that authority. And that leaves Tennessee and all of her sister states completely 100% empowered to enforce any policy that they see fit for their state. That's a wonderful thing, man. I mean, we really do have the power to have the immigration policy that we here in this state would prefer, regardless of any federal fecklessness, because they're going to continue doing that because it's in their best interest to increase the threat to our safety. Because as the danger increases, so do the cries for please help and save us. But we don't need that help.
Well, now, and I will say this, Tennessee in particular, we're kind of our own worst enemy on this because, while the federal government, we've looked to them, we've deferred to them on immigration and securing the border as everybody else has for all these years. But for instance, in 2022, Tennessee passed a law that would give the DACA recipients, which the DACA kids, and which are not all kids anymore, but the DACA people are not here legally, okay? They are still considered illegal aliens. They have no legal status. They've just been allowed to stay, but they are still illegal aliens, and courts have ruled such. But what our state did was it granted them the ability to get professional licenses in the state of Tennessee. All because the federal government says, here, they have work authorization. And so our state is treating them as if they are here legally. And it's not just them. Of course, now everybody coming over the border is getting work authorizations. So it's not just limited to the DACA kids who might have been brought over here when they were young and have been here for years or whatever. Still no excuse to accommodate them, in my opinion. But our state is no help on this issue, unfortunately. But what you're saying is we can actually defend our state. We could actually, if we wanted to, just say, hey, no, you cannot come to Tennessee, you cannot stay in Tennessee.
That's right. We could not only can we have absolute unassailable constitutional authority to do that. There's no one that could challenge that because per the clear terms of the 10th Amendment, any power not delegated is retained. Well, you find me the clause in the Constitution that grants to the federal government the authority to say who can and cannot enter Tennessee. You won't find it. Lots of people like to argue the naturalization clause, but I'm telling you, crack a book, y'all. Immigration is not naturalization, right? Engagement isn't marriage, right? So we don't have to explain it away because if someone wants to challenge it, the response to that is ready and at hand, as Madison said. The response is, show me where immigration was an area of authority granted to the federal government in the Constitution. If you cannot show me that, then the default stipulation is the 10th Amendment, which states very expressly any power not granted is retained. So there you go.
So since they don't have any clear constitutional authority, then what are they operating under? What's the federal government operating under?
Well, they're operating under two things. They're operating, number one, under usurped authority, which is something they're very good at. They've been doing that for hundreds of years or, over 100 years. And they're operating on our ignorance, to be really honest. If you ask somebody in the street, a good, well-intentioned conservative person, should the federal government be controlling immigration, they're going to say yes. And so the federal government relies on our ignorance of constitutional principles. Right? It's like Thomas Jefferson said, if you want to be ignorant and free, you want what never was and what never will be. And so the federal government insists that we be ignorant. And that way we do not know. And so we start fighting a fight that doesn't even really need to be fought. We're trying to, do you see the twisted logic? The federal government, we're clamoring for them to impose an immigration policy, which is the most anti-constitutional position, although it seems to us the most conservative constitutional position. But in reality, the opposite of that is true, and every state retains the authority, complete authority, to enforce immigration policies within the sovereign borders of that state. And again, usurped authority, taking authority that doesn't belong to them, and depending on the ignorance of the people, right? And that's the authority they're working under. They're working under assumed authority, usurped authority, and it's supported substantially by the ignorance of the people.
And Supreme Court decisions.
Well, that includes the ignorance of the people, because for some
Right.
reason people think Supreme Court opinion has any sort of merit. Go look at your supremacy clause, so-called supremacy clause.
Right.
Article 6 lists the supreme law of the land, and Supreme Court opinions are not there. And, you go read the words of, there you go, yeah, you got it up there. So you notice what's the supreme law of the land? The Constitution, laws passed by Congress in pursuance of the Constitution, not in defiance, and treaties. Well, what's missing there? Supreme Court opinions. They are opinions. And we have been taught from kindergarten up that if the Supreme Court says something, that's the final word, despite the fact that the Constitution does not say that in Article 3. The Federalist Papers explicitly deny that authority. And the statements of the founding fathers on that subject are clear and convincing, that to allow 5 black-robed judges to overrule the will of 330 million Americans is to take a republic and turn it into an oligarchy.
And you would have to believe that if that was their intent, that they spent 8 years fighting the most powerful nation in the world at the time and going through everything they went through just so they could set up a system where a decision, an opinion by 5 judges, or whatever the majority was when they initially set up the number, would determine their freedom, and not just their freedom, but the freedom for all their descendants from there on out. And that just does not make sense, that they would have bothered to have had a revolution to overthrow the king just so they could have 4 Supreme Court decisions determine their rights from here on out.
Right, because you imagine the thing they were fighting against is the fact that Parliament was enacting laws for the colonies in defiance of the English Constitution. Now, Parliament was a huge body of men. You can imagine if a huge body of men making laws for the colonies upset them, how upset they would be if 5 men, and members of Parliament were at least elected by somebody. Supreme Court judges are not elected by anybody. They are unaccountable, unelectable. And so what ends up happening? It ends up that they end up ruling without authority. And that's how it goes. And we've been taught that they're allowed to do that, and they're not allowed to do that.
So, and I know in the Constitution it talks about the Supreme Court having the authority to hear cases. But I think they seem to forget that, the 10th Amendment is part of the Constitution as well, and as well as the entire Bill of Rights. And so you have to read it with the understanding that those things that are prohibited from federal authority, and federal authority includes judicial federal authority,
right?
That those things are not things that should be taken to court if they are off limits according to the Constitution. Is that a correct understanding?
That is a perfectly expressed understanding of that. If it is denied to the federal government, well, guess what? The Supreme Court is part of the federal government. It's Article 3. It may be as Hamilton supposed and as the founders supposed, it would be the weakest of the 3 departments. It turns out to be not the weakest of the 3, but if it's denied, if a power is not granted to the federal government, including the Supreme Court, that power is retained by the states and the people. In fact, the funny thing is, I've done so many articles about this over time, and they're not popular because it's difficult to undo all these years of being told that the federal government needs to clamp down on immigration. The federal government needs to clamp down. No, immigration needs to be clamped down on, but needs to be clamped down on the states. To demand that the federal government do that is ironically for constitutionalists to insist that the federal government exercise authority it doesn't possess, right? And that it goes back to that whole thing, the ancient author Thucydides, who says, men are just too lazy to look up the truth. They're just going to accept what's first taught to them, And so that happens a lot. That happens where people will be too lazy to actually go and look up, and they're just going to believe whatever is first taught to them. But we have the opportunity to say, look, guys, they don't have that authority. Let's take advantage of this. And if you go to, Congress has tried over, since 1789 repeatedly to impose some sort of immigration policy, and it was repeatedly vetoed by presidents because presidents from, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, all the way up through Ulysses Grant said, I've looked in the Constitution, I don't find authority for the federal government to impose immigration policy. This is a matter for the states.
So when did they start doing it, illegally or otherwise? When did they start actually taking over that?
The late 1800s, early 1900s. Once you had a complete abolition of sovereignty after the 14th Amendment was forcibly ratified, which you cannot forcibly ratify something, right? The only legal basis of government is consent of the governed. If I occupy your streets with an army and tell you you're going to ratify something, that ain't you ratifying it, right? That's not consent. And so, but after that time, so beginning about the 1880s, when the so-called Reconstruction was completely successful in the South, then you had this legacy of liberty that was quashed by these, jackboots that went down to occupy the South. And so what you end up having is the Congress realizing that they did not have to abide by the Constitution because there was no authority that could stand up to them. And the people, frankly, were just tired, man. They were, you're talking a quarter of the men in the South were killed as a result of that war. We were just tired. And so it came down, take advantage of that and impose federal authority where the authority to impose those policies does not exist. But we were just too weary to stand up at that point. But I believe now we're at a point where this understanding of constitutional restrictions has spread widely enough throughout the states that we do have some sort of inertia towards that, where we could say, guys, let's not demand that the federal government do something they don't have authority to do. That's playing the game by their rules. Let's completely say, you know what? Thank you, swamp, for doing nothing because you have no authority to do it. And now we're going to show that we do understand the Constitution. And it's not hard. It's not difficult because all we need to do is two things. We need to get people informed, and then we need to get those informed people to elect other informed people to represent them in the state governments. And like I say in that the book you talked about, What Degree of Madness, nullification, you can sing that as a solo or as a choir piece. It doesn't matter. If Tennessee is the only state that recognizes the true and proper constitutional construction of this federated republic, then that's fine. The rest of them don't recognize it. Well, oh well. They don't need to. But if we do, we can follow the 10th Amendment and we can impose. And can you imagine the effect it would have on our sister states if they could see a bunch of constitutionalists electing like-minded constitutionalists to the assembly who would pass and enforce a common sense immigration package. It would spread like wildfire because you would see these people say, well, look how successful. I mean, you see it with simple migration patterns within the United States, right? Everybody from California moving to Tennessee. Why? Because we do it a lot better here than they do it out there. We do liberty better out here. And so we can do it. We can turn it up a notch out here as well. We can say, you know what? We're doing some things good. We need to do those things better. and we need to start doing some things that we haven't been doing and start doing, and we can do it. And boy, I'll tell you, you talk about a renaissance. That's just what we need. We need these little, what Samuel Adams called these brush fires of liberty. And we just got to light a couple of them. And there's enough people, I believe, that are willing to listen and learn and admit that maybe they were, indoctrinated in the government schools the way all of us were, and learn that they were, the reason you don't know you were brainwashed is because you were brainwashed.
And everybody else was too.
And we all, that's right. We were all, but look, I'm going to tell you, it's painful. Yeah, it's painful. It was painful for me to realize that I was raised, a good little Republican and an Army brat, and was raised like that. And it was a little painful to realize that some of the things I thought the federal government should do and actually encouraged it to do, they had no authority to do. That was painful, but boy, it's painful to get a tumor cut out, but it's much better than dying of cancer.
So what would it look like? So I know in Texas right now, the governor is doing some things on his own. He is using, and I don't know to what degree. I know they've got the barriers on the Rio Grande, and I know that they're doing some things. So basically, I guess a state, they could call out their guard, the National Guard, which we do. That's a problem, because ultimately that's not the militia force that we were intended to have. The feds can kind of take that back over. That is a problem. That's a whole separate issue. But he can call up and have the border defended. He can set up barriers. He can, if he catches people, according, if we're following the 10th Amendment, which is the Constitution, and he can turn them back. He doesn't have to allow them to stay in his state. Now, what play, if things were doing right, I guess if things were going right, then, if things were going right, we wouldn't be in this mess, and the federal government would not feel empowered to lead an invasion. And that's what they're doing. They are leading this invasion.
Purposefully.
Absolutely.
We've got to, open our eyes. We've got to awake to a sense of our awful situation. There are people purposefully who are on this earth to destroy our liberty and the liberty of all nations. And we've got to stand up to those things. We can't keep pretending that this is some political battle. This isn't a political battle. This is a battle for the future of our liberty, a liberty granted to us as a legacy from our Creator. And so we have a sacred obligation to stand up for that liberty. And the way we can do that, there are so many ways. And it's like one of those things, I just want to see some people have some good ideas. For myself, I've suggested that the governor deputize landowners across the board, on the borders of the state. Deputize those who own land along the borders of your state to patrol those borders, to hire people to patrol their borders if they want to, private security, which is completely constitutional.
Right.
Therefore, you don't need to worry about the federal government getting involved, because like you said, the National Guard is not a militia. And so the federal government, their ears won't be pricked by, we're calling out the National Guard. No, you could use letters of marque. Letters of marque are constitutional. The founding fathers put in the Constitution, Congress may issue letters of marque. That means turning private citizens into soldiers for the purpose of combating a very specifically, expressly identified enemy. Brother, what stops us from doing that?
Boy, I think that would go over really good in Texas and Arizona.
Oh, well, yeah, I agree with you 100%. But again, we're dealing, the biggest battle we have in front of us is not an invasion. It's not even federal tyranny. The biggest battle we have is ignorance. And it's like Montesquieu, in his book, Spirit of the Law, Montesquieu said, you had these Roman leaders that would come and try to restore liberty to Rome, but they were unable to do so for two reasons. Number one, the Roman people had lost all their virtue by this time. They had lost all their manly desire to be independent and free. They'd lost that. And the second thing is, whenever that you could prick their ears and get a little excited, kind of kick that steel toe into them, they would aim at the tyrant rather than at their own acceptance of tyranny. So what we need to do is, rather than say the Democrats aren't doing this, the Republicans aren't doing this, Biden's not doing this, say, why am I sitting here obeying and waiting for commands from people who have no authority over me?
And
we got to start fighting. We got to start fighting the tyranny and worry less about the tyrant, because there is no tyranny without obedience to the tyrant.
Absolutely. Well, and in our case, and in the case of everybody, it's their states, and I know our state's complicit. I mean, we have a pathetic governor. Our legislature, we have a supermajority of Republicans, but most of them don't have any, they don't have a backbone for the most part. You know, now, to their credit, a couple of years ago, they did do a nullification resolution, but you know, we'll see if they have backbone if they actually enact the nullification process like Representative Halsey put forth last year, and will be back in the Assembly again this year. But we have to force our states to stand up, and in addition to us pushing back, our best option, in my opinion, for our country to have a chance as a whole is, personally, I think, divine intervention and state intervention. But we're going to have to force our state to stand up. And so some of the things you've talked about, and you know, county sheriffs are huge, because, like for instance, there in Texas, those sheriffs could deputize people to help them, especially in the border counties. And I imagine there's other deals that they could work out to where people not on border counties would be able to maybe work with other counties. Is that pretty much on track?
Yeah. Oh, county sheriffs are could be a huge boon to the effort to restore liberty and restore sovereignty to the state. They have worked in the past. I know I've done speeches for the Constitutional Sheriff and Police Officers Association. They used to hold conventions where there'd be hundreds of sheriffs from around the country, and that it just kind of petered out. And that's how it is with most things. It's consistency, right? We just have to consistently push. And you talk about the Declaration of Independence and that phrase, the long train of abuses and usurpation. Well, they were putting up with that, and it got to the point where they said, look, this is never going to change. And you would think that we'd gotten to that point as well by now. And you said that part about divine intervention. It reminded me of that quotation from Algernon Sidney, that was one of the Founding Fathers' heroes. And he said, if a private man does not prepare to defend his estate with his own force, it's because he lives under the protection of the law, and he expects the force of the law should be a security to him. But kingdoms and commonwealths, acknowledging no superior except God, can reasonably hope to be protected by him only. And by him, if with industry and courage they make use of the means he has given them for their own defense, for God helps those who help themselves. And so, yes, sir, divine intervention and state intervention, but let's show God that we're getting this thing kick-started, and we're willing to use the mind that he gave us, to use the heart that he gave us, to use the blood that he gave us, to use all of these things with which he has so richly blessed us for so long and so extraordinarily. God helps those who help themselves. Well, let's start helping themselves, and then I think we'll see that divine intervention that both of us agree is going to be necessary to sort this all out.
So there's some other ideas you might have about what states could do to deal with this Fed-led invasion?
I think the best idea would be to and one of the things that James Madison says in Federalist 46, which is the sort of the springboard for that book, What Degree of Madness. One of the things Madison said was have states get together and sound alarms with each other. Have states meet together and say, are y'all noticing this? Well, if you get a lot of states together, two heads are better than one. You have somebody from Tennessee say, hey, well, we have this idea that since there is no immigration authority in the Constitution, the 10th Amendment very clearly says that we retain that right. And other states who may not even consider that suddenly consider that. And it becomes easier to get that ball rolling. And so I agree with Madison. I think meeting together with representatives and with people in other states and saying, Do y'all see this the way we do? And if so, let's work together in our respective states to, here's a package of legislation, for example. I'm just, spitballing here. But if we have one of these meetings, let's say we had Texas, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, we all get together and we say, okay, we agree that there is no federal authority over immigration. We agree that, therefore, by the clear terms of the 10th Amendment, that power is retained by the states. Here is what we've done. I call it Madisoning the business, because Madison showed up at the convention with a plan of government ready to present rather than showing up and ready to argue about somebody else's plan. We could do that too. We could show up and say, here's a package of legislation that we're going to propose in Tennessee, and we would propose you all do it at the same time, and we can have all these clocks strike the hour at exactly the same time, and people will take notice of that. Whereas if it's one feckless individual attempt after another, it'll get ignored and it'll run out of steam. But if you got 13 states at the same time having the same packet of legislation introduced to their individual state legislatures and supported by speeches that will attract what, so-called earned media, so the news and whatnot, that will make a difference, and that will get the ball moving. But if we just see, well, the crazy Texans are doing something, people in the South are always causing trouble, that's not going to get it done. But we've got to do this, what Madison, this union of interests, and we've got to sound the alarm, and we've got to come together. And if we exercise a little bit of prudence, and if we come together and we present people with a turnkey solution, rather than say, don't get in there and say, okay, Georgia, what's y'all's idea? No, get in there and say, everybody, we've got a plan. Here it is. Let's talk about this plan. And when we leave here in a week, we're going to have a pair of bills, one for the state house and one for the state senate. And we're going to get this thing done, and we're going to work on them together. We're going to teach each other about them while we're here. And that way we'll be able to convince the people back home that what we're doing is in their best interest. Because I'm telling you, think about the power is immense and immeasurable to say, guys, pump the brakes. I agree the feds haven't done anything over immigration. Well, guess what? We don't want them to, because they don't have that authority. And if we encourage them, think about it. If we encourage them to behave unconstitutionally in one way, that gives them the tacit authority to do it in any other place. Absolutely. We don't want that. We don't want that. Hold their feet to the fire the way we're supposed to. It reminds me of that anti-federalist Cato. If you want to read something that will chill your blood, well, you probably don't want to do that. But if you ever are in that mood, if you're ever like, hey, I really want to read something, get me fired up, read Cato number 5. Not Cato's letter number 5, but Cato number 5, the anti-federalist, where he says that if we do not act to destroy the tyrant, then that will force our children to wade through seas of blood to do that which we could have done with just a little bit of prudence and a little bit of wisdom and a little bit of sacrifice. I don't want my children wading through seas of blood to do something I could have done with legislation.
Absolutely. And everybody talks about how much they care about their children and what they'll do for their children, but it just, I don't see a lot of people stepping up to the plate.
There's a lot of talk.
That's a downside to that, but I think you're right on that. Now, one thing that I did see, Article 1, Section 10 talks about states having the right to defend themselves when they're invaded. Of course, this is a Fed-led invasion, and I saw somewhere where I guess Texas was, they think they got a solid case to take to the Supreme Court under Article 1, Section 10, and I'm thinking, why would you take it to the Supreme Court? Why are you going to go back to the federal government to let the federal government determine the limits of federal power? Because if you do that, aren't you thereby implying that if you rule against us, we're going to go along with you? Isn't that something they should just say, look, hey, we're doing this because of Article 1, Section 10. Look it up.
Yeah, to let the other team's coach be the ref seems really stupid to me. I think anybody just make football analogies out of everything, man. Just say, look, would you let the other team's coach be the ref? No, you wouldn't. You want an impartial ref. So don't take it to the federal government and ask the federal government to restrain the federal government. That's not going to happen, particularly in areas that you're having to argue arcane points of constitutional construction. Don't do that. Just realize that where there is no authority granted, that authority is retained. And all you have to do when challenged is just say, two simple words, 10th Amendment.
A few years ago, and I think it may have been the Obamacare decision or something related to that, Justice Roberts, by no means a conservative constitutionalist, did make the statement that states are sovereign entities. Sometimes they have to act like it. And that's what we need our state to do and every other state, act like a sovereign entity. Here's the thing that really irritates me the most when it comes to the supposedly conservative Republican states on the issue of immigration or illegal immigration. Mm-hmm. The left, for years, the leftist governors in all these states that wanted to set up these sanctuary cities, okay, in violation of federal law, and I understand, you're saying that they don't have the constitutional right to do that, but they would defy federal law. And they weren't claiming any constitutional right to. They weren't claiming that, they just did it. Mm-hmm. Our guys have something on their side, if nothing else, their own self-preservation as a state, and they won't do it. They're just like, well, they just want to complain about what DC's doing and not doing, but they won't ever just step up and step out and say, look, we're going to do this, and if the federal government, tries to stop us, we'll just ignore them. A lot of times it's just a matter of saying no. Everybody seems to think if there's an issue between the state and the federal government, and if you don't go the court route, that you're automatically talking civil war, and I don't think that's the case, and that's certainly not the intent.
No, and what just occurred to me when you said that is that, all of these guys, that book you mentioned, The Founder's Recipe that I wrote, all those guys the founders quoted, every single one of them mentioned that if you want to know if the end is nigh for your commonwealth, you will notice a spike in effeminacy. And it just occurred to me when you were saying that we refuse to step up. How effeminate is that for men to sit around and say, oh, I'm going to get on Facebook and I'm going to post a meme about Joe Biden falling asleep. And that seems very effeminate to me. I think the more, and remember, the word virtue is the Latin word virtu, meaning manly. And I think the way to go about this is to say, look, I know that so many of you, nearly 50-year-olds have a vested interest in your terminal, adolescence. But let's get those of us who were maybe aware of our obligation to protect our families. What stops the rest of us from saying, as my daddy used to say to me, lead, follow, or get out of the way? Absolutely. So if you want to sit there and do nothing or do silly things and, fight your fights on that little screen, there's a real battle. If you want to show that you're a hero, get off Call of Duty and answer the call of duty. There is a real war going on. And you sitting there over there with your, insipid joystick fighting digital stuff when there's a real war going on, that is the very definition of effeminacy, and it is going to ruin us. So those of us who recognize that there is an obligation, we need to boldly stand in defense of our liberty the way our fathers did. And when, to quote the immortal Captain America, when the media and the government says move, you say, no, you move. And that's our obligation as men. I don't see that. It's one of these things people say, well, Joe, that's just your biblical worldview because you're a Christian. Yeah, I'm proud of that. I'm very proud of that. And I think that if we could get Christian men to put down the joystick and take up their sword, so to speak, we could sort this out really quickly, man. We could really get this sorted out. But when you've got, 45, 50-year-old teenagers who are content to fight fake battles in a digital world and let the real world swallow up their families, I don't know how we're going to do it. Someone asked me the other day, like, how are we going to get this war? How are we going to take down the tyrants? I said, man, taking down the tyrants is second on the list. First thing we got to do is get rid of the enemy among us, who are clogging up the pipeline toward freedom by their lethargy and by their immaturity.
Yeah.
Let's get around this. Lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Absolutely. Ignorance and apathy are that's what allows all the corruption and all the tyranny. That just breeds it.
That's it. How long that verse of scripture? How long are you going to sit on your throne in a stupor? How long are you going to sit there in a stupor? Just like foggy headed. How long are you going to sit there in front of that blankety blank screen? How long are you going to sit there in a stupor while the world comes crashing down around you? A world that good men who came before you sacrificed blood, treasure, and sacred honor to secure for you. How long, O Western man, are you going to sit there and let that happen? Because the clock is ticking. And if you are, like Samuel Adams said, right? Crouch down and lick the hands that feed you. We want not your advice nor your counsel, right? Because if you're content with that, fine. But when it all comes down, don't come to me to defend you, because I gave you the chance to sack up and be a man and take control of the situation. Help us rid ourselves of this tyranny. Help us rid ourselves of this moral morass that we're all swimming around in. Help us do this. And it can get done, man. Many hands make light work. Why do you think our ancestors had like 20 kids?
We have
that farm.
Go ahead.
No, I just saying they had that farm. 20 kids made the work a lot easier.
Yep. Well, we have the government that our founders were afraid of, and the government that they set up the Constitution to avoid, but it requires effort. Like, just because it's written on a piece of paper, it takes some enforcement, and we have to be that enforcement. We have to insist. If our state reps and our state senators, if they don't believe in the 10th, if they won't fight for the 10th on this issue and everything else, then we need to get rid of them. We need to get people in there who understand that you can't have a free country. You can't have what the founders intended if you don't have limited government. And you don't have limited government if you don't follow the 9th and 10th Amendment, bottom line.
And I get so tired of seeing people, I got my pocket constitution. Is it seeping transdermally into your brain? Because you don't know what's in there, man. You don't know what's in there. And if we could that's what I'm saying, education, that's our first priority, is get people to understand what is and is not in the Constitution. And then I believe once you pour this old wine into new bottles, as the scripture says, I think once you do that, you will see a bunch of people getting fired up and ready to do something, because they will finally, for the first time in 200 years, recognize the eternal value of liberty. As Thomas Paine said, right? Heaven knows how to put a price on its goods. And such a celestial object as freedom, boy, it has a high price, right? It has a high price, but let's all chip in. Let's all chip in to purchase that celestial object.
I want to just talk a little bit in general, not necessarily related to the border, but if you can apply it to that or immigration, that's fine. But so nullification or interposition in general, just touch on nullification and interposition. And I know there's not a whole lot of difference, but if you can just touch on that a little bit.
Well, I think, people have, it's one of those things that nullification, what's that saying that, let's see, it was Cesare Beccaria who said that a little knowledge is worse than ignorance. And so it's like when people think of nullification, they think of, that's what led to the Civil War. And so an interposition is a word they've never heard. So what I like to say is just constitutional fidelity. Let's enforce the Constitution. And then the first thing I always say to people is go home, read the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, written by Jefferson and Madison respectively, and you will instantly understand more about the proper function of the Constitution and the proper constitutional relationship between the federal government and the state governments than you could learn getting a PhD in American history at any university. Simply go home and read and ponder and really strive to understand what Jefferson and Madison are saying. They are saying the Constitution is a contract. That contract created an employee, an agent, and we call that employee, that servant, that agent, we call it the federal government. The contract contains the entire scope of that employee's authority. That employee has no authority outside the four corners, so to speak, of its employment contract. If it acts outside of that employment contract, it is only common sense that the employer need not adhere or in any way ratify the acts of that employee that are outside the scope of its employment contract. And once we can get people to understand that the states created the federal government as an agent to work on their behalf, the way I teach it to people sometimes is like, look at this. Suppose that I were a celebrity, and every time I came out of my house, paparazzi and people just, so I hire a bodyguard. I hire a bodyguard and I say, here's your authority bodyguard. You protect me when I go outside. Well, if he's standing there on the porch and I walk out and he beats me up every day, and he takes my wallet, he won't have a job the next day. And if he does, that says less about him and how perverse and wicked he is, and more about how ignorant and self-loathing I am. So all we do is say, guys, realize that this Constitution is a contract. It created a employee who exists for one reason and one reason only, to improve the status of the employer. I'm not going to hire an employee that loses my business money. And my employee, if I say, hey, your responsibility is to sell this widget that we make. If that employee goes out in the afternoon and buys a car in the name of the corporation, do you think I'm going to pay the payment on that car? No, no one would. No one would. Everybody said that guy didn't have the authority to buy cars for the company. Of course not. But for some reason, when you take this analogy and you import it into the Constitution, people lose their mind and think the federal government can do whatever they can get away with. And Montesquieu said it clearly. Once a tyrant starts grasping at power, it's going to continue to accumulate power until it runs up against some limit. Well, we need to start showing that there is a limit. And the states can say, here's the contract. What you're proposing to do is not in your employment contract. Therefore, you have no authority. Therefore, we're not even going to recognize that you're doing that. And if we have to fire you, we will. But we're giving you a warning. Just like in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote that, right? We're not going to just do it like that. Yeah, I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to say, look, you messed up. You did something that you weren't allowed to do, but I'm going to give you another chance. That's human nature. That's kind. That's merciful. That's right. That's just. But, fool me once, shame on you, and fool me twice, shame on me. And we've been being fooled for over 100 years now, man. And at this point, we can't shake the finger at the federal government. We need to look at the mirror and say, why do I accept being treated as a wage slave by people whom I have elected to serve my interests? Yeah. Why am I allowing myself to be debased like that? Why is the creator dancing to the tune played by the creature? And that is ridiculous.
The two biggest lies that the people believe, they misunderstand the supremacy clause, and they think that the Supreme Court, that any Supreme Court opinion is the law of the land. Those are the two biggest mistakes that we've made, two biggest problems. And we've just got to stop. We've just got to put our foot down on that. Nullification and interposition. You mentioned Jefferson and you mentioned Madison. Of course, Jefferson wrote the Declaration and he laid out those long train of abuses. But if you look at what the founding generation did from starting in the 1760s all the way until 1776 when they declared independence, which was a year after the fighting started, as you know, that was interposition and nullification. America was born out of attempts at interposition and nullification. Does that sound accurate?
The 13 colonies seceded from the British Empire. And it was explained that way in England, that the 13 colonies were attempting to secede from the empire. In fact, you can read in newspapers of the day, I have a collection of newspaper reports from England regarding the War for Independence, and they most clearly understand the constitutional situation, that you had 13 colonies who were attempting to secede from the Union, claiming violation of constitutionally protected liberty. They even describe the War for Independence as a civil war. They describe it that way because that's what happened. There's no difference between 1861 and 1776. We've just been taught by government schools. We've been indoctrinated differently. Right. But those you read the last paragraph. The last two paragraphs of the Declaration, read those out loud to yourself, that each one of those 13 states is now recognized on par and with power equal to the state of Great Britain. That's the understanding that the founders had. And you talk about the Supreme Court and the Supremacy Clause. I'm telling you, the idea that we're one big consolidated nation, we got to fight against that one. And anybody that wants to get a little gulp of that, just go open up Federalist 39 and have yourself a tall glass of that. And James Madison clearly explaining, no, sir, we did not create a nation. We created a confederation of 13 sovereign republics. And once you understand those things, this is the glory of presenting this information this way. That isn't my opinion. I can give you my opinion of how we do it, how we exercise, how it looks, how we manifest this understanding. But the opinion that the Supreme Court is not the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution, the statement that the Supremacy Clause does not grant the Supreme Court that power, and the position that there is not one consolidated country, all I have to point to is Madison, the Declaration, the Constitution. I don't have to give my opinion. And if you feel froggy against arguing against James Madison, then jump. But I'm not gonna wade into those waters. I know for a fact that man is twice the man I'll ever be, particularly with regard to his understanding of liberty and constitutional construction and the history of Constitution in England and America and all over the world.
Right.
And so once we got to get that inertia. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. Let's get the object in motion, and it will stay in motion. And we've just got to get people to understand these things. So I would say if you want to everybody watching and listening, if you want to have more of an education tonight than you had in all 4 years of high school and all 4 years of college, if you went to college, and if you did, I'm sorry. But if you want to have a better education tonight than you ever got then, do yourselves this favor. Google and read the Virginia Resolution by James Madison, the Kentucky Resolution by Thomas Jefferson, and Federalist number 39 by James Madison. And you will go to bed tonight a better informed patriot than you were yesterday. And maybe you come to have that conviction and that courage to say, do you know what? I didn't understand this stuff yesterday. I do today. Where do I enlist in this fight to restore the liberty granted to us so graciously by our God?
I got one last question for you.
Yes, sir.
How important was the 10th Amendment to the ratification of the Constitution?
There would have been no ratification of the Constitution without the 10th Amendment. Frankly, I just wrote an article about that today for the New American because today is the anniversary of the congressional resolution being sent out to the states with the Bill of Rights. And the fight was intense. And I do recount that fight in the book I wrote, the Real James Madison. That fight was intense. They fought over that because some people wanted that 10th Amendment to be a whole lot stronger. And finally, we got it passed. Yeah, they're perfect. It is inarguable. It is an unassailable fact of constitutional history that had that 10th Amendment not be included, the states would not have ratified the Bill of Rights, period. And had the promise of the Bill of Rights not been made by Madison, the states wouldn't have ratified the original Constitution. Simple as that. And now imagine being a man with such impeccable character that you can promise people to do something and they take you at your word for it. That's power. We can get back to that. We can go back to that manly virtue that defined our founding fathers. We can do that. We're no different than them. We can put in the hard work and become those people.
Well, Joe, thank you for being with us tonight. I'd love to have you back. I appreciate what you do. I enjoy reading your articles. And I have read What Manner of Madness in reference to Madison. That was an excellent book. It's not a very long book, but it's got a lot of information on it. Oh, and I love the hat, Make America States Again.
There you go. Make America States Again, y'all. That's the answer to it, right?
Absolutely.
The answer to this problem is just make America states again. And if we can do that, we can restore the liberty granted to us by our God and vouchsafed for us by our founding fathers. We can do that. We owe it to them. Let's man up and do that for them and do that for our children. And we can get it done. I guarantee you we can get it done. It just takes many hands make light work. And that's all we got to do.
And the alternative is, just look where we're headed. We really don't have an alternative. If you look
the alternative,
the way
the alternative is right. The alternative is, like I said earlier, that Cato number 5. Requiring your children to wade through seas of blood to restore liberty that you could have restored with legislation.
Yeah. And even though I know a lot of people think this upcoming presidential election and yes, it is important, but even if Trump gets elected, that's not going to fix our problem long term. The institutions have been taken over by the left. Over the last 100 years, they've taken over all the institutions. So if even if everybody who thinks Trump is the only answer to all the problems, and I'm not knocking him, he's done some great things, that's not going to solve our problems. We're not going to solve our problems till we return to the intended structure, because the Constitution really doesn't work if you're not following it. It doesn't work if you don't read the instructions and apply the instructions.
Right, and the Constitution, as well written as it is incapable of governing an immoral people. Let's be honest with ourselves, man. It starts at home. The Constitution is incapable of governing an immoral people. Right. And if you keep sending your kids to Rome, to school, they're going to come home praising Caesar. And it's been too long. It's been too long.
Absolutely.
If you're sincere about this, follow these men that inspired our founding fathers and restore these principles. But you got to get these kids out of those Roman schools if you want to take down Caesar.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks again. Great to have you on. Thank everyone for watching. And if you enjoyed the program, please hit the like button and subscribe. Our guest next week will be Paul Engel from News with Views, speaking on executive orders, limits, and constitutional questions. Thanks so much for watching.